and really introduce ourselves. Ooh, thank you, James. We can really pay attention to valuable introductions. So with that, let me go ahead and move from our opening slide. So today's webinar is developing river-based field courses from brainstorming to implementation. And this is all sorts of years of work with this, and really looking forward to this webinar. So again, thank you for joining us. What we're going to do is break this webinar up into 3 parts. The first part, we're going to be focusing on learning objectives, student-centered learning objectives, and how you take those to a course. The second sections are going to be, what is your dream course? We're going to go big and allow folks to really dream away. And then the third part, what we're going to do is identify and discuss some very common obstacles for running river-based field courses and some strategies to overcome those. The plan is to use a mix of discussions, breakout rooms, brief presentations, and we're going to work hard to keep it within the 90-minute window. So with that, let me go ahead and get us started. And it's going to start like this, with this wonderful question, right? So you want to do a river course. And as soon as you ask that question, or as soon as you say something like that, you got to ask, well, why? Why do you want to run a river course? And certainly for me, for much of my career, and I imagine this probably works for other people as well, that often starts with something like this. Boy, I really love this place. I love this river. I want to be here. I want to do this again. I should take some students so I can be here. And although there's nothing wrong with that, and the passion is absolutely what you need, what we encourage folks to do is take that, reframe that passion into a student-centered learning experience by starting with the learning objectives that you can achieve on the field course. So it looks something like this, and this is going to be a theme that many of you, certainly within the network, have been exposed to before, and I imagine that many of you in professional lives have been exposed to this before, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But in essence, backwards design. Backwards design, before you do anything, you start with the student learning outcomes. What is it that we hope our students will gain, develop? Keep that in mind, and then we design an experience. In this case, we design a river course that can help us achieve those slows. So same passion, we just flip the way we think about it. So one thing that we've been doing in the River Studies Field Network is we've been collecting syllabi. There are lots of people in our network that run all sorts of wonderful, crazy river courses. We are collecting those. We pulled the slows for this particular exercise. We pulled the slows off of all of those syllabi, organized those into categories based on similarities. And then for this webinar, we placed those into Jamboards. And in the breakout rooms, we're going to view those slows on the Jamboards. And once we get into there, you'll see how they're broken up. But basically, each Jamboard is a collection of like slows. And the idea here is it's designed to help stimulate you as you think about a river course, as you think about your slows, as you help develop this. There's also, because it's a Jamboard, they're interactive, you can then go in there and add slows if you want to as we're doing this. So with that, I'm going to transition and let Sarah Yarnell take over from here, and Sarah's going to build us from slows. You get a learning objective, and then what do you do with that? How do you scaffold that up to the next phase?
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So just to take a moment. So a student learning objective, we're going to talk about them more. You're going to see more of them on the Jamboards in terms of, but this is basically like, what's the course goal? What do you want your students to get out of the course, and why you're excited to teach the course? The folks who are river scholars, we've talked a lot about developing learning objectives for lessons and particular tasks that we're doing, but there's also learning objectives collectively for the course. One of the most common ways that we look into basically trying to achieve a learning objective. Like, how do we go about, you need to declare the learning objective. Like, what is the goal? I would like students to have a skill in doing something in the field, maybe making a river map or a study site map. And the best way to achieve that then is to go through and develop a process, right, where you get them excited about it. You have an intro to whatever the topic is that you're of interest. You're going to develop or demo a lesson about it or about that particular topic or learning objective that you want. Implement it, you do it. So you demo it for them, you do it for them, and then you come back and review it. And so this process is really common when you're like having a learning objective or something you want to do. But the interesting thing about it is that we can think about that for a lesson or an individual task or a lab that we want to do, but we can also think about it at the course level. So if you click again, Andy, thanks. And so we think about how to achieve learning objectives for a course, building off of lessons that we put together or ideas we have and labs we have for what we want to do, using this idea of a scaffolding approach, right? So we might say, okay, I want to go to the Grand Round, like that Jamie was talking about at the very beginning. It's a cool place. I want to bring students there. And I think maybe one of my learning objectives for the course might be to get them this experiential education and to look at the biology of the river. And to do that, I have some lessons where maybe they need to learn how to take a macroinvertebrate sample, or they need to go out and do some seining or fish. And so these, for scholars in particular, we've been focusing on this aspect a lot. And for those of you who are not a scholar and are just part of the network and are here today, we have a whole series of field-based lessons that the network has been putting together. These are posted on cubes that you can find. And many folks often have their own labs and lessons. And so each lesson has a specific learning outcome. You introduce that lesson, you demo it, the students do it, you review it, right? And you go through that process. But we can stack those together or scaffold those together and think about what lessons contribute to the overall learning outcome I want for the course. And even in a middle section, thinking about scaffolding or stacking lessons together, there might be 3 or 4 or a handful of specific learning outcomes you want for your field experience for that course. So this could be whether the whole course is on the field, or if you have part of your course in the classroom and part of your course is in the field. There could be aspects of your larger course that are maybe modules or a field-based module, whether it's a day or multi-days. And you might have specific outcomes you want them to get that you're going to organize your field trip towards to have them get that. But you can follow the same process, right? Your intro and your closure can be the pre-trip meetings and the briefings that happen before you go on your trip, and then the review after the trip and the reflections the students might do after the trip. And then you've got these demos and do's that you do on your lesson, during your trip, that could be these different activities. So when we think about the course as a whole, you can even frame your syllabus in that way, where you're starting with an intro and it includes a welcoming to your course and this idea of inclusive group forming and bringing them together about the topics, working your way through some of the lessons, doing things, doing lessons, doing your trip, and then at the end, having your course also have a closure. So this just is one way to look at thinking about this idea of a backwards design and starting with the learning outcomes and using those learning outcomes to frame how you might want to build your syllabus and how you might want to build your syllabus from a series of lessons that you can put together. And so hopefully the goal is to talk about this more when we get into the breakout rooms and have examples of some learning outcomes in front of us to help put some course together. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to show through, we have a bunch of course syllabus that Andy was saying that collectively we're putting together. So there's a lot of examples about how people put together a field course syllabus that might be different than a traditional class syllabus. And there's a couple key things that we want to think about for the field. And I'm just going to show a couple screenshots. So how do these student learning outcomes get placed into a syllabus? If you want to, I know there's a lot of clicks, Andy. So
no worries.
Yeah, so for example, in a lot of our syllabuses, you look across the example or the way that you might write a syllabus, you're going to start with a course description, and there'll be goals and some even descriptions of the overall learning outcomes. So here's a crop out from one of John's syllabuses, one of our River Network members, and he very clearly actually just lays out his learning outcomes in his syllabus at the beginning. That's one way to do it. If we go to the next one, Other examples might include course goals, right? So here's one of James's, right, from Footprints on the James, and he's got a course overview of what the course is about. And then down in there, he's got goals. Students should be able to X, Y, Z. So we're framing these overarching course goals that can be really clearly distinguished up front in the syllabus. If we click again, here's another example. They could be bullet form. Here's one from another network member, and it's in paragraph form down here at the bottom even, right? You will be familiar with the subjects of watershed, management and wildland hydrology. So inherently, a lot of us think about putting these course goals in, and all we're really trying to do with this idea of backwards design is use those course goals to then sort of put together the pieces within our field course that will help us to get there. So if we go to the next slide, then, and your syllabus really can help provide a roadmap map for this. So click again, Andy, thanks. In addition, other aspects that are important to be included in syllabus besides, of course, we talk about the grades that the students want to have. How are you going to achieve your points? What are the expectations of the students? And again, this is really traditional and very common for all courses. But if we click again and think about Riverfield courses, it's really important to have aspects about safety and resources. We're going to be out in these environments, and we want to provide additional resources for them in their syllabus. And there's examples of these and things that we've talked through a lot in the network that can provide if we click again. And they can have a variety of different formats and ways that we often see them in the syllabuses: policies, resources, aspects about codes of conduct are really important to put out there for the students. And then even when we go to the field, if you click again, there might even be sections of the syllabus where we're actually talking about expectations, not just for the students, but also for that field trip itself, right? And so in laying out our syllabuses and thinking about moving towards those goals, in order to achieve those goals, students need to know what is expected of them. And they need to know sort of the bounds and the rules about how we expect them to behave, how we expect ourselves to behave, and how the group as a whole will behave when we get in the field. So these are important aspects that you'll see common across a lot of river course syllabuses and syllabi. Okay, and then lastly, one of the things that we see a lot in the syllabuses, if we click again, is this idea of a detailed schedule. And this again takes, when we peruse through the syllabuses, we see a lot of different ways that this can branch out, but it's really helpful for the students to understand not only what are they expected to do in each class, again, that's a common practice for regular course syllabi, but also in the field. And so if we click again, you'll see how these might include not only preparation for the fieldwork. So if you look here in week 1, you'll see that there's topics being covered about biodiversity and ecological function of rivers, but also gear review and what kind of gear the students are going to need, and ropes and knots. Like John has a section in here on ropes and knots he wants the students to understand. So we can be adding in some of these aspects that are specific to the field expectations and field components that our students might be needing within their weekly schedules that can be placed into the syllabus. So there's a lot of planning. One more click just to give a different example. So here's another example about looking at like lectures versus labs. And in this case, those lessons that we want the students to be working on can be embedded into these schedules, where there might be student learning outcomes within a lesson, and then there's sort of and those might be more specific, and then student learning outcomes within the larger field portions that collectively go towards the course. So I'm going to stop there just to give a quick highlight of sort of how we can use these student learning outcomes to design our syllabus. There's a lot of thought and a lot of preparation that needs to go into sort of crafting these, but we have a lot of examples out there that folks can look towards, and we'll have some discussion about that as we move forward into the breakout rooms. Okay, that's the end of that. Super fast, super brief overview for you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah. That was great. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to sort of prepare us to transition into the breakout room. So what we're going to do here in a minute or so, we're going to move into 4 breakout rooms. Each breakout room is going to have a field network co-PI. So myself, James, Matthew Brown, or Sarah Yarnell will be there. We'll spend on the order of 25 to 30 minutes in the room. We wanted to really allow a lot of time to have a rich conversation that just didn't feel like it was time crunched. So we gave lots of time for that. Once we come back from the rooms, we will jump into the third phase of the webinar, and Matthew is going to tell us what we're going to do in the rooms.
Great, thanks, Andy. Well, okay, as Andy mentioned, we're going to spend approximately the first 5 minutes or so. Less interaction once we do maybe some introductions in our small little groups, but taking some time to just peruse the Jamboard that's been built from all of these syllabi and looking at some of these student outcomes. So Andy likes to describe this sort of as a buffet opportunity where we get a chance to just peruse the opportunity for outcomes and then maybe, think about 2 or 3 that we were really intrigued by or that we gravitated towards. This is also your opportunity to add anything to those Jamboards if you like. And then after a moment of that, we'll sort of reconvene that, review it for a bit, and then we'll have the opportunity to share our course idea. And so this could be like your dream course, or it also might be a reality. This might be something that you're maybe potentially teaching this spring or on the schedule to teach this summer. And you're looking for some opportunities to really implement an amazing field opportunity and experience for the student group that you'll be working with. And then finally, one of the things we really wanted to talk, especially when it comes to course development, are just, what potential challenges or hurdles do you see coming your way that you feel like, boy, this could be a real make or break with this class? We'd really like to share those. And that'll be our breakout room time. And again, we want to really spend some quality time just sharing and hearing one another's course ideas and what we're struggling with.
Okay, awesome. Thank
All
you,
right.
Matthew.
Shall I
James,
go ahead?
I think it's all you.
And when do you want us to, who's going to keep an eye on closing it? Is that you, Andy? Just to make sure we got a,
Okay.
or because we're going to breakouts until 5,
21 after. I bet we can go. Let's set it for 29 minutes.
okay.
Enjoyed those. I know I did. And what we are going to do here is we're going to switch over to the third phase of the webinar. Hopefully you all had a chance at the end of this of the breakout rooms to kind of identify what are your next steps, what are your concerns, what are the obstacles, those sorts of different things. And so we'll move to this third phase. And let me go ahead and share here. And start to frame it. Everybody see that?
Yep.
All right. So we've certainly been having these types of conversations with the network. And in that, we have identified some very common challenges that we have to consider and manage as we put together these courses. By no means is this exhaustive, but these tend to be the ones that come up most often. So what we're going to do is each one of us, Sarah, myself, James, and Matthew, are going to take one of these subjects, kind of walk you through what are the challenges and what are some ideas for getting around those, and allowing some discussion at the end of each one of these. So Sarah, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, I'll start us off. Yeah, so go ahead. So so in terms of like, you have this great idea, you're thinking about your learning outcomes, thinking about how to structure the syllabus, how to get your students out there, and then we run into these challenges, right, that we're talking about. And one of the biggest ones, of course, is how to pay for it. So just a little overview in terms of the cost of river courses to the students actually varies quite a bit. We did a survey early on as part of the network, asking people who teach field courses, how much do your students pay? What is the kind of typical cost? And so here's just a breakdown from 70 survey participants within the network of what their students typically pay. And it's interesting because it's maybe ever so slightly skewed, right? Like the good news is it does look like a lot of people are figuring out ways to keep the costs really low for their students. And so we'll talk about that in the next slide. But then there are, a fair number of courses where, kind of on the other end where students are having to pay quite a bit more to get out. So and the concern is that the more that a student has to pay to be able to take a field course, and get out onto the river or get outside, is that becomes a barrier. And so, collectively often our goals and, what the reason why we talk about this and share ideas is to try to figure out ways to move more of this graph to the left, right? Like we ideally don't want our students having to pay the bulk of these courses if we can. Paying for the bulk of the course, the cost for the course if we can. And so what are some creative ways to do that? Also, just to highlight that the cost typically in terms of most expensive, transportation. So these types of costs represent some of the categories of what we're responsible for paying for to get our students out in the field. And they're ordered in from most to least. So the most expensive cost that people run into to run these courses is transportation, right? Getting your students to the location, whether it's planes, trains, automobiles. And then if you get them out there, are they staying do you have to move around the river site? Are they in boats? Are you driving from location to location on the river to get access to them? And that really ends up being the biggest cost that most folks are running into. The food and accommodation, of course, we're feeding folks out there. They need to stay. If you're camping, that's pretty cheap accommodation. If you're staying at a field station or a lodge somewhere, obviously that can be a bit more. You got to feed everybody. Group food, you can get creative. The network, there's if this is something that you haven't done, there's lots of menus, lots of resources within the network to help you all plan your field courses and figure out some of these things. There's lots of experienced people to talk to. Ultimately, we'll have checklists and menus and things that can be shared. You've got some gear and equipment costs, boats and those types of things, and how you're moving around. Survey equipment. If you're having labs and lessons that the students are doing while they're out there, you need to provide that gear for them. You can borrow it, right? There's strategies, and then of course permits and access fees to go to locations. Okay, on to the next slide then. Thanks, Andy. Okay, so there's actually quite a few funding sources that are out there. We've been compiling resources like this for the network to help everybody out. The students, if you look at currently, this graph down here just shows how the total cost for the field courses are being funded. A lot of the courses, those expensive ones, the students are paying. So if the students are paying $1,000, $1,500, they're covering most of the cost of the field course. However, there's a lot of grant opportunities and proposals that are out there, state grants, NSF grants, proposals that can be put together to help fund this. Private donors actually end up being huge resources. Alumni who have taken the classes can often contribute, both at UC Davis and I know at NAU, we have pretty strong alumni programs that, folks went out, did these courses when they were students. They're now successful adults living in the real world, making real money, and they love the idea of paying it forward. So tapping into an alumni network or donation network can be a huge resource to help essentially offset some of these student costs. And then the universities and departments, it's really hit or miss. Some programs, the departments are, really helping to cover the costs of the courses, and sometimes it's not. So some creative ideas are just listed here that a lot of us have leaned on, this idea of alumni sponsors or mentors coming out, kind of doing a pay it forward. Sometimes the students will fundraise. They may not have the money, but if you can help them do some of this fundraising, going to their deans, going out into the community, working with local community groups. There's strategies that various folks have used to try to come up with that funding. Local community groups love to pitch in and help and train. And so sometimes that can be resources, shared gear sheds. Hey, I've got a spot. If your students want to come camp in this area, I'm happy to have them come camp on my property, that type of thing. So there's a lot of ideas that can be shared. And the network has been working to really kind of compile those together to help you all come up with ways to overcome some of the fiscal challenges. Okay, and then I think that's it, right? Next slide moves on to, so questions, sorry, discussion and questions. Any questions or ideas we want to talk about collectively together? Questions you all have? Ideas. Just feel free to unmute and jump in.
I'll ask a question here, Sarah. Mm-hmm. The work that you and Danielle have been able to do with the alumni, and that obviously is working of itself. How'd you get that started?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share that. So I can't speak to Danielle's program specifically, only what we've heard her talk about. She invites alumni on her trips. and says, hey, you pay your full cost, and hey, you want to chip in a couple $100 to mentor a student and participate to a student. So she reaches out to individual alumni and invites them, a couple people on the trip. That's one strategy she's used. At UC Davis, we actually have, as a big university, there's a whole group, like department. I don't know if I would even call it a department, but a program that is alumni outreach, right? These big universities have, your university likely has a group on your university campus somewhere where their whole job is to just go get in touch with those alumni to solicit donations. And we went to that group and we said, hey, we have a really cool, unique student experiential program that is training the next generation of students in the experimental learnings. Do you have any alumni who you think have expressed interest or might be interested in supporting this type of student training? And then we worked with them, and it's kind of a bit of a slow build. Sort of start small and build a little bit bigger. But over time, we actually have ended up receiving many small donations from alumni. And then they have helped us cultivate one or two large donors. So some of our bigger trips where we've taken students down the Grand Canyon, which is not cheap, there have been donors that have been super excited about being like, that's amazing. I 100% want to pay for that. Right. And these are alumni that were at Davis like 30 years ago. Right. So we worked with our alumni group to really encourage them to help us find those donors. And that's their job is to help. So that was I didn't have to necessarily do that. I just had to go find the people at the university who could help me do that. And that's been a really successful partnership for us. Cool. Great questions. Anybody else? Or other thoughts or ideas? Maybe there's something we didn't list there that you all have done or figured out how to do. Oh, James commented, can I read the chat real quick? We've done a River Film Festival night at a brewery to raise money. It's been labor intensive, but the yield has been really great. Yeah, I love that idea of helping the fundraising and helping the students fundraise. Also really good ideas.
I'll add just as a now part of an R1 institution, maybe you all are well aware of this, but I am slowly butting up against this, is if you want student course fees on your courses, at least in my university, it takes forever to get them on the course. So if you want to have a fee attached to your course, even if it's not that big, at least here it takes like at least a year.
Wow.
Yeah. So plan ahead.
Cool.
All right. Well, thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and shift to the next one. Oh no, it's James. James, take it away.
All right, next slide. So I'm going to really whiz through a bunch of slides here, but I think, some of the barriers or challenges are we're trained to teach in classrooms. Actually, we're not even really trained to teach in classrooms. We just do it. And so that's often the approach we take to doing field classes. We just do it. But actually, there is a professional field out there that people do this for a living, and there's some standards, right? So I think of like the dealing with field course logistics is kind of like stream ecology methods, textbook, meets outdoor experiential, and like, what is the combination of those? Was that what a river field course instructor looks like? Next slide, please. What kinds of things affect logistics? Well, as we've I hope we've framed, is like students first, right? So student factors should be part of your logistical considerations, and obviously what your learning objectives are. And so this is a great paradigm for thinking about course design. The reference is listed here. It's from one of the key papers from the Undergraduate Field Experience and Research Network. But this whole context factor part over here is like, think about your students' worldviews, their interests, their identity, their prior knowledge and skills, their motivation, expectation, prior experiences. Those are all important to thinking about course design, and that will shape the logistics, in addition to what your intended goals are, and try to think about that as you're designing and how that will impact your logistics. Next slide, please. One thing that we probably already appreciate, even if we haven't gone too much in the field, is, class versus the field. Well, that influences you. It's easy to teach things in the classroom. You can give a lecture, you can do discussion, you can do more active learning in the classroom. It's cheap. Even once we start to do take it to the field, even in a simple context, well, now we're thinking about people in the field. There might be some occupational health and safety field protocols at your institution for taking students in the field. Are you doing scholarship that involves people? Do you need an IRB for that? Are you even just looking at birds? If you're looking at birds at my institution, then you have to have an IACUC permit. Even if you're not doing research, that varies from institution to institution, but at my school, I have to think about that. Maybe there are local and state handling permits. If you're going to be seining for fish and identifying them, even if you're going to be putting them back, does that require a state permit? So there are all those kinds of logistical things. Just thinking about any kind of a field lab, the equipment involved. So you're increasing the cost. So just kind of like the teaching approach, the taxonomic group, those can influence your logistics. Next slide, please. Once you've kind of I've got these students, I've got these learning objectives, I do want to go to the field with them. You might be thinking, well, where do I want to go? Now, I suspect most of you already have a river in mind, so I'm not going to belabor this, but site selection is important. And so if you were kind of starting de novo, hey, I've never done this before, how would I kind of find a river where I could take students out on? There are some great resources out there. Each of these, we'll send the slides to you. Each of these are linked. The National River Project, the National Water Trails Database, American Whitewater. Those all have national databases which have, access information where you can get in and out of rivers. Often they have flow information and maybe descriptions about safety as related to flow, when it's high, when it's too high, or when it's too low to actually take students on the river, if you actually want to be on the river. And then, of course, there are local, more regional resources that you can click. For me, like the Virginia Outdoor Mapper has all the scenic rivers in Virginia and all the access points, and so that can be really great. And then everybody should play around with Sam Lerner's River Runner app. If you don't know it already, drop a point on the map of America and follow it to the sea wherever you are. It's super fun. And so that's a great way to also kind of visualize, well, what if my students were to sort of start here and kind of follow the river down? So check out that app. Next slide, please. But once you've got a river, then you might be like, okay, so can I access this river? Is there a public access point? Is there not a public access point? Is it public and doesn't require a permit? But there are also public rivers that require permits. How do I know if I need a permit? So once you start to think about a particular river site, then you might need to think about, your ability to access and whether or not you require permitting to access that. I've had to use, some cases I use HuntX, which is a hunting app that people use in order to know whether you can go onto somebody's property to hunt. We had a class where we had a really hard time finding an access point for a river that we were going to be surveying for a scenic rivers class. And that was one of the focal results from our report, was this river can't be in the scenic program because you can't actually access it legally. But then here's when we took students to Big Bend and we did a multi-day canoe trip on the Rio Grande, we had to write to the Big Bend National Park and say, we have a student group that's coming in. We're applying for a student use special use permit. I had to send my syllabus, and then they approved us to be able to access the park for free, and the river as well. So thinking about those access and permitting things. Next slide, please. If they're actually, relative to the amount of rivers in America, there are not that many that require permitting. If you're, there are kind of cool rivers, and that's why they require permits. But if you go to American rivers, there's these are the rivers in America that are commonly floated that require permits. So there's some databases that have permitting information as well. Next slide, please. Obviously, duration. When we think about, when we're kind of thinking how much are we willing to take on here with doing this river field component? Half day on campus to the creek, that's still river field. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum would be, a long multi-day river course. Within the network, I think the longest course we have as group that's affiliated, the river semester at Augsburg. I think they do 800 miles over 40 days on the Mississippi. They build their own boats. So you know, and so as you're thinking about the duration and how you package the field components, you know, that then may influence, like, are you doing an overnight? So then you're going to need accommodations. Are you being accommodated in a field station, and you're going to be place-based, kind of coming back, you know, foraging out from the base and coming back? Are you going to be doing that from a front country camping situation? Or are you going to be moving and traveling in a multi-day format? So those are obviously increasing in their logistical complexity depending on what you want to take on. Next slide, please. We've already heard someone mention, like, well, how do you even get to the site? That's one of the most costly things. Obviously, on campus is cheap and easy, relatively accessible. But oftentimes we might want to drive to a site. Even if we're not going to be traveling on the river, we might want to drive to a river and sample at the river site. So that means then, are students allowed to use personal vehicles or not? What is the liability at your institution associated with that? Some universities really discourage it. Some are open to it. It's actually changed at my university pre and post COVID. If you're using university vehicles, does your university have vehicles? What is the training that's required to have a driver? Does that mean that are you trained to be a driver, or are you going to have to hire a driver, a student driver? Are you going to use, in some cases, you might be able to get to the river here in Richmond by public transport. You can get on the bus, in the city bus, and kind of get down to the park, and that's happened. There are other occasions when you might have to hire a private bus. We've only had to do that once. It was during COVID because the 15-passenger vans didn't have enough spacing. So we basically had to hire a local outfitter who had an old school bus so that we could have the, you know, required COVID spacing in the bus. We only had like 7 people in this like 30-passenger bus, and the windows open, and they let us do it. So those are logistical things to think about. Are you actually flying somewhere? Is it domestic? Is it international? That obviously adds additional layers of complexity. Next slide, please. If you're actually going to not just go to the river, but then travel on the river, I mean, first, obviously, you can access it and you can move along the river by foot. That creates, you know, certain kinds of safety considerations. Maybe you need equipment considerations like waders. So that might be, but that still might be your easiest. Or using canoes, or using rafts, or using other craft. Where are these craft coming from? Do you have them in-house at your institution? Are you going to need to require to have essentially go to an outfitter and essentially outsource that requirement for the class? That's going to obviously add to the cost potentially. And also, you know, how would you pick a good outfitter? How do you know if you've got an outfitter that's giving you, you know, good standards and safety practices? So as you start to think about, you know, how you want to move down the river, different types of interaction moving down the river have different logistical, you know, challenges associated with them. Next one. And similarly with logistics, you know, as you're going from a day trip to a multi-day, that gets more complicated. Next slide. As you increase the duration, you might be needing to feed the students. If you're just doing an afternoon, you still may want to encourage students to bring something to eat, and obviously water and snacks might be necessary. So even in a short trip, food might be something that you're considering as part of your logistics. But obviously, if you're going to do overnight, then that becomes a bigger question. Where's that food happening? Are you going to kind of eat on the road, or are you going to be providing food? If you're going to be providing food, then that you know, there's a menu that needs to be made. Maybe there's cooking involved. Is there additional equipment in order to deliver that? There are safety issues, both hygiene wise and just kind of kitchen safety to think about if you're going to be taking that on. So there's a lot of responsibilities and challenges with feeding a class in the field. But at the same time, I would say from personal experience, you know, the sharing of meals and preparing meals together in the field can actually be one of the most powerful community building components of a field experience when you bring those pieces together in an effective way. Next slide, please. And this we'll send these slides to you. And this is, you know, there are we have sort of resources for, you know, meal plans for in the field, and this is just one example you can click on later. Next slide, please. Obviously, factors that affect your logistics. What equipment do you need? There might be equipment that's specific to your curriculum. You're going to need a flow meter because you're going to be, measuring flow as related to fish habitat use, as this lesson did. So there might be specific things that you need for that. There's going to be, group gear lists, particularly and that can get large if you're actually traveling on the river together. And then, what kind of personal gear lists do you need? And I'm going to give you some examples of those in a moment here. But here we can see that John's got it covered. Not only does he have a sun hat, but he has 2 sun hats, and he's got his glasses, and he's clearly got his sunblock on. So John, he's got a hoodie. So John gets full marks for, reading the personal gear memo on this trip. But so how do we prepare our students to know what personal gear to bring? That's something that we would need to do as part of organizing our field course. Next slide, please. So collectively, you can see, there's a huge continuum here. And really, I guess, like, how do you even dive in? And I would say, again, like, what are your learning objectives? And then what's the simplest way to achieve them, and build from there? On one hand, like, quite simple stuff that probably all of us would feel comfortable doing on our own, walking to a site near campus, or taking a campus van nearby, something on university property. You just need snacks and water. They need to come with the field clothes on. They don't need to bring anything extra. In terms of safety, it's just like your local 911 or your campus security. If there's some bad weather, it's easy to reschedule. No accommodations needed, no actually cost. So that's sort of one. I mean, that's still it could be a river field experience depending on where your campus is located, right? On the other end, you've got the river semester where they build their own boats. They do 800 river miles. There's lots of multi-day river planning, multi-meal planning. There's, significant personal gear, complex for different environments. There's probably gear swapping. You're going to have to allow them time to wash their gear because it's such a long course. Complex evacuations and hazards. You can see that, a full semester course can get quite complicated. So again, like, start simple. And I think the value here is, like, rather than kind of like, this is the river trip I'd like to take, it's like, what's the river what's the kind of river engagement that's going to help me meet my learning objectives? And then kind of building from the simplest model that you can there. Is all your adventuring that you're doing, is it actually mapped onto specific student learning objectives? And if it's not, maybe question why you're doing it. Next slide, please. Once you start to think about that, though, you can think like, okay, here's what I'd like to do. And then it can be like, well, who's the team that's going to do this? Are you going to do it yourself? That's one option. Are you going to do it with partners in your institution? Some of you may have this option. If there's an outdoor recreation program at your school or a club, they may be a source for protocols and safety liability coverage. They may have equipment that you can access. They may have staff and personnel that can support you in the field. Here at VCU, that's been our real model. Is almost all of our river field classes are actually run as joint. Oh, I've been sitting still too long. As joint OA VCU outdoor adventure program trip/classes. And we do that. We parasitize their liability structure. We use all of their equipment, which we can use essentially at cost because they're an institution nonprofit. And what's more, we've discovered that they are essentially outdoor professionals who are trained and have credentials in expedition planning. And so they are able to support us in rather ambitious agendas. And kind of carry the professors along, as it were, to make sure that the field component is carried off well. But not everybody's going to have access to that. Lots of other folks use outfitters. And so that's, looking for an outfitter in your area that can support the field component if you want to do river travel. That's another model that's worked well within the network. Next slide, please. I'm not going to click on this necessarily. You can click, there's a hot link down here at the bottom. For me, one of the things I've learned from my colleagues over at our outdoor rec program is that, the trip plan is almost as to the trip what the syllabus is to the course. And in fact, as you're doing a hybrid, then they kind of merge together. But if you click, this trip plan will detail it gives the itinerary. It's got an example of personal gear list in there. It's got an example of group gear list in there. It's got a full menu for the entire trip. that you can see an example of. It's got and it's also got some important sort of safety communication information should there be an emergency in the field. It's kind of all bundled into one document that we take with us when we go into the field. It's kind of like the cheat sheet for the course. Now, the one I've shared here is very complicated. It's for a long sort of multi-day course, so don't get overly hung up by that. You could easily take some of the examples here to like kind of do just like an overnight thing, but there's a lot of menu options to think about and so forth. And so that'll be a resource for you to kind of peruse on your own. But I found it really helpful. It's something I've learned from the outdoor rec people in terms of framing this kind of the expedition or the field trippy component of the getting the, supporting the STEM objectives in the field. And also, teaming up with them they're often very effective at teaching sort of some of the effective domain goals that we also include, like building leadership and community. They have a lot of good techniques for trying to help us achieve those outcomes. Next slide, please. And this is it. It's simply to say that was a whirlwind, and there are a couple of links there that I hope would be useful to you. But they're also, we're scholars, and there are resources out there to help us learn these things, right? So this is a domain of outdoor leadership, outdoor education, and this is not exhaustive, but just kind of get out there and take a look at some of the other resources that are out there that kind of think about this kind of the field portion of participants. Next slide. And thoughts. Kinds of logistical concerns. There's a lot there.
This is specifically related to VCU, but I'm curious to see how this plays in. What are you doing now that, or do you still have OAP?
Yes.
Okay. I for some reason I associated
Carl with Carl was one of 5 staff. So we have 5 professional staff in our outdoor rec program and a number of student trip leaders. And so what happens for like our field course, the trip that's linked there, the trip plan that's linked is we get a lot of support from the pro staff, the faculty essentially. They're like faculty, and some of them teach courses for us in course design and planning. But then a lot of the field component is actually student trip leaders. So we'll be out there in the field, and they won't be students in my course. They will be student trip leaders who are paid at student hourly rates by the outdoor rec program to lead my class on a particular segment of the river that has been planned by the pro staff over there. So it's an amazing resource, and we couldn't do what we do without them.
All right. Well, I'm gonna shift over. Thanks, James. Fantastic resources out there. So, and we'll make these all available for everybody. I'm going to take it over from here, and what we're going to do for this next little bit is look at the obstacles that exist, these challenges. But look, these are going to be internal looking. This is not about what river or what vehicle, but it's actually the internal gaze. How do we manage our administrative structures? And then we actually batted the term around for a while, because it's one way we think about this is red tape or bureaucratic blah blah blahs. But at the end of the day, it really is an academic structure. And I think if there's one take home for this little section I have here, is that it's going to be incredibly valuable for you, particularly as you start a new course, to understand the administrative structures within your institution. How does your institution work, and how do your bosses interpret your policies? And before you take a proposal to them, you really need to understand the way that they think about it. So first, I'll start with probably the most common one related to administrative structure, and that's the scheduling. The nature of field work is extended time, and extended time means conflicts. There are lots of ways around this. I've just bulleted a couple here, obviously using weekends, right? And this works for the 1 days and the 2 days. A very creative and arguably, in my opinion, the best way to do it is if you have blocks. You have a block of time. There are some institutions that have blocks of time that are designed for this type of experience. Most don't. There are professors within our network that have been very creative with how they manage things, and they actually create a block within the semester or quarter where they have students taking multiple courses and all the students take the same courses. That way you can decouple them from their schedules and then have them for longer periods of time and get creative with how you want to schedule it. Now it takes a bit to pull it off, but the outcomes are certainly great if you can pull it off. The other obvious way is working off semester or working off quarters, depending where you are. There's always a winter break. There's a spring break. There's summer breaks. There are Maymesters. There are windows of time that you can use where the conflicts with other classes don't exist. And then another real common way that people manage this is hybrids, where the lecture material would meet during the semester, and then after the semester, or maybe during spring break, there'll be extended field time that doesn't conflict with all the other classes. That hybrid works pretty well. It depends on how your institution wants to handle that. Then a couple of the other ones I just want to mention really fast, paying attention to your workload. Some institutions, if you do something off semester, that means it's out of load, which means it's extra, and some won't pay for it. Some will do it in load. There are plenty of conversations around the quantity of work. Do field hours, are they more than lecture hours? Are they less than lecture hours? How does that work? And what does that mean for you as you plan your work? Enrollment thresholds. Field work is going to require most often a different faculty-student ratio. You can't take 900 students to the field and talk to them with a microphone. Well, you could, but I suggest you don't. So those ratios are going to be something that you have to consider, because what you're going to need, and this is critical, is you're going to need some kind of institutional support. You need that support from your boss, whether that's your chair or dean. You're going to need it probably from your colleagues, people within your department or across departments. I recommend as much as you can seeing if there's some external partners that can help you. OAP, kind of external. There are groups out there that maybe can help. And again, really important to understand how the administrative structure works, because when you take your idea to your chair, you're going to dream up this thing with your arms waggling and wiggling, and then they're going to stroke their whatevers, and they're going to look at you and they're going to say, why are you doing this? So understand what they think about, and then approach all of those challenges as best you can, and then take that to your administrators before you start proposing it. So I will shift to the discussion phase, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Matthew, who's got some important stuff to come here. But any thoughts on this one?
I was just going to offer up that in terms of collaborating, supporting groups, the River Management Society is the host. Many of you are familiar, but some of you may not be. They are the organizers for the River Studies and Leadership Certificate Program that some of our schools are in. And the regional mandate for the regional chapters are that they run chapter trips. And in the Southeast here, we just did a joint, the 3 certificate schools did a joint river trip down on the French Broad. It was just a weekend thing that we organized, but it was at no cost to the students. And so I think the society is really looking for more ways to engage between the schools that are participating and the society in general. And I think this river trip nexus is maybe not a full-blown course, but there might be ways to get some river experience where you're out there with river professionals who may have boats and may have access to some of these resources. And then the society will kind of often in some cases may subsidize the cost to the students. So I don't know if it's what you build a course around, but it might be an experience as part of a course, something like that.
Okay, thanks, James. I'm going to pass it over to Matthew. Take it away, Matthew.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, well, I think in the sake of time, I really want to make 2 important points here. this is dealing with our risk management, really our safety, from looking at like physical safety, our social, emotional well-being as well. And so I've got 2 slides, and one is this whole idea of having that risk management plan that could be embedded in the trip plan that James shared. That contains a lot of this important risk management piece, but really making sure that this plan is in place and that you've thought through all of the department and institutional risk policies before a course is expanded, changed, presented, anything that goes to your department or to a dean, because I can't tell you how many times I've sat on risk management committees for new course proposals, and these little components or pieces weren't thought through. And some of these are dictated, of course, by the administration themselves. You may already have a set of emergency contact procedures, but making sure you're familiar with those and able to implement them is just a really crucial piece of this whole thing. And then, of course, this also includes, the training and the components for things such as emergency care. Do you have staff that are on hand and able to do that? Do you have a travel plan and a travel route procedure and check-ins along the way so that someone is tracking you and the students? And I think in a lot of cases, sometimes even these really important risk pieces can be brought to the rest of the departments, sometimes deans, provosts, other folks, because we're not always necessarily aware. And the one thing I see a lot of the time is that we're so excited to implement these field experiences, enhance our student learning outcomes, offer this great opportunity for some really immersive learning. And we kind of, we think it's better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission, so to speak. And we sometimes try to squeeze things in. And that really does, I think, unfortunately, deteriorates the class, raises the anxiety if you're leading a course. And so thinking about the little components along the way that make for that risk management plan. The other piece I really was excited to share, if we can go to the next slide, is looking at the in-field procedures for social and emotional well-being of our students. When our students sign up for a course that has a field component to it, that has a field trip, it's really a contract there that they are taking the risk to go into this class and maybe put themselves in a more uncomfortable position. And in return, we want to really provide for their well-being. And so not only does this require us having our heads on a swivel during maybe downtime during the course or intermediate sessions when we're transitioning from one thing to another, but it also really means that we pay attention to that whole person. And so this concept of whole person education, where when we're in the field, it's also their social well-being. It's also their physical time. We need to create the time and space for all these things to basically interact and intersect in a way that feeds the whole person. And so that can, of course, run through everything from initiatives and activities to leadership components and other pieces. And I'd really encourage folks that if you don't have a student learning outcome in a field course that's related to some of these aspects, then check out the great resource that we used when we were doing our breakout groups and look at some of those, because I think they really enhance the student experience significantly. And then finally, last point is if you are leading a field course with an extended field component, overnight trips that might be 2-3 days, involve some camping or time away, I really wanted to turn people onto the resource of the behavioral first responder. And I'll put the link for that in the chat. It's offered by Alpenglow. It's real similar to basic first aid type training, but with a behavioral component. And it covers some incredible aspects that might come up in a field-based setting.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Matthew. I know we're a little bit beyond here, but some really important topics there that you walked us through. Folks want to ask a question or have a discussion with this one? All right. Well, for the sake of time, let me go ahead and move on. We're just about at the end here. Wrapping up our webinar, just going to kind of recap what we're talking about here. You start with the end, just like your mentor might have told you when you started grad school. Start with the end. Start from the slows and then build your course. Step 2 that we talked about here was dreaming, right? Dream big and then identify the challenges that you need to negotiate to implement it. Build that plan to address your challenges. You got to start early and use the resources of this network. We have built ourselves around creating a network that facilitates, increases capacity for river field courses across the nation, because this is something we all really believe in. And I think we're probably speaking to the choir here. These are wonderful things. These are game changers. These are life changers, and we want more of them. So use us. Sorry, collectively, I think we can figure it out. So I do want to note that we had talked about building and sharing an action planner. When we built it, it occurred to us that this document's far more complicated than we were ready to share. And so we need to vet it some more. We need to edit some more. But do stay tuned, because this is a resource we want to make available. So with that, James, just pass it off to you as we close out.
Yeah, not much to say here. Simply that looking ahead in the next couple of months, we'll be putting out the application for the next training cycle, probably early December, and recruiting that cohort. We're going to start a little bit later this year, probably bring them on, identify them by February, bring them on in early March. And we're going to kick off this year with the focusing on the field river rendezvous as kind of like the kickoff event this time. And then in January, we will have the virtual gathering like we did last year. That will be, we'll give a report out on the year. But most importantly, we'll have the next cohort sharing their new lessons that they're creating right now and editing to publish on Cubes. And we usually have a guest speaker as well. And so that'll be a fun event. Next slide. And I encourage any of you who aren't already on board to think about joining. This is going to be kind of a spectacular opportunity. We scheduled this rendezvous on the Klamath to take advantage of the historic dam removals that are occurring right now. And we will be hosted by both some of our leadership team, but also faculty from the area who lead courses on this river and are really well plugged in. So I think it's going to be a really amazing opportunity for learning. So if you haven't been on a river rendezvous, this would be a fun one to be involved with, I think. So keep an eye out for those applications if that's something you would. But those are the dates there, and so you would look at your calendar and see if you got that free before you apply. That's all I got.
Okay. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you all so much for spending your Friday afternoon, early evening with us. I hope this was valuable for you. And I really encourage all of you to just continue to reach out and help us collectively build the capacity and the quality of the river field education that we offer as a collective. So enjoy the holidays, everybody. Hope you get some time with your family, catch up on some sleep. Don't catch up on grading. Catch up on sleep and catch up on family, and look forward to seeing you at our next gathering.
Thank you. That was great.
Right.